From APM, American Public Media.
WinGuard, a Jacksonville-based marketing and communications agency, provides public relations support for client partners across multiple industries. A strong PR strategy can help local companies, nonprofit organizations, and executives tell their story effectively. More at wearewinguard.com. The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. The Senate continues to review the tax cut and spending bill favored by President Trump. This hour, senators are scheduled to propose amendments to the legislation. Republicans can only lose 3 votes in their chamber, or the bill will fail in the Senate. President Trump has called on Israel and Hamas to make a deal to release hostages from Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel's war with Iran has led to new opportunities to free hostages. As NPR's Daniel Estrin reports from Tel Aviv, Israel is also seeking a diplomatic deal with Syria.
Prime Minister Netanyahu's close advisor Ron Dermer is expected to meet U.S. officials in Washington to advance a potential deal for ties between Israel and Syria. That's according to a person briefed on the matter, not authorized to speak publicly. The prime minister's own corruption trial was postponed this week after Israeli intelligence chiefs convinced the judges that Netanyahu was busy with important diplomatic and security issues. Israeli media reported it was related to Syria. Also, Israel's military chief of staff met with top government officials Sunday to discuss the future of the Gaza war. The person briefed on the matter said Israel's military estimates troops need 2 more weeks to complete their objectives in Gaza. Daniel Estrin, NPR News, Tel Aviv.
NPR has learned the Trump administration is using a new tool that's creating a list of verified American voters in order to track citizenship. NPR's Miles Parks reports the SAVE program builds on a tool already being used by the Department of Homeland Security.
SAVE is a tool that's able to ping a bunch of different immigration databases to get an answer on citizenship status, traditionally for legal non-citizens. Now, thanks to DOJ, the system can also ping data at the Social Security Administration, which keeps point-in-time information on U.S. citizens when they get a number. So when you combine those two capabilities, essentially what DHS says is that they should be able to check the citizenship status of almost any American in the country legally, because almost every American now has a number.
But some legal experts have told NPR they're skeptical of the tool's legality. There are federal laws that govern how new data systems can be created with Americans' personal information. Authorities in northern Idaho say they're investigating a fatal shooting yesterday that killed 2 firefighters. From Boise State Public Radio, Jackson Holmes reports they were responding to a fire.
At a press conference, Kootenai County Sheriff Bob Norris said about half an hour into fighting the fire, personnel were ambushed.
We started receiving over our radio that the firefighters were receiving shots fired from the mountain.
Both local and federal authorities are responding to the incident. Late Sunday evening, law enforcement found a deceased male with a gun nearby. A shelter-in-place order has been lifted, and there is still an active wildfire. For NPR News, I'm Jackson Holmes.
You're listening to NPR.
You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning, I'm Stephen Ponson. It's 9:04. A North Jacksonville neighborhood group is asking a federal judge to stop the medical examiner's office from putting what they're calling a morgue near them, saying it threatens their health, safety, and dignity. The federal lawsuit was filed back on June 20th, a year after the Metro Gardens Neighborhood Association sued the city to stop a multi-million-dollar facility from being built in Brentwood, a predominantly black community. Neighborhood Association President Lydia Bell says she wants a federal judge to weigh in on the possible hazards of having the facility near a school and their homes.
And I want them to just read on. If he could find any wrong in this, then they need to rule on it. But if they listen to us and we have a fair judge, they will find that they broke every law on the book. to put that morgue in our neighborhood.
The group's lawsuit alleges the city broke the law by not telling the community about the facility. City spokesperson Philip Perry says the new facility will be completed by September, and the city will not comment on the injunction due to active litigation. Jacksonville Mayor Donna Deegan could announce a new fire chief for the Jacksonville Fire Rescue Department by early this week. Former Fire Chief Keith Powers announced his retirement back in May. There are 5 candidates who are up for the position. We have profiles of each at jaxtoday.org. Scattered showers in the forecast later on this afternoon for northeast Florida. Highs will reach the upper 80s to lower 90s. Overnight, we'll have lows dropping down into the 70s.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Your Part-Time Controller, specializing in nonprofit accounting and committed to supporting nonprofits with financial management services such as budgeting and forecasting. yptc.com/NPR.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, Jacksonville native and Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Kevin Sack explores the deep roots of resistance and racial justice that defined the Charleston, South Carolina congregation of Emanuel AME Church before and after the tragic mass shooting. Later in the program, we welcome a virtuoso pianist and Douglas Anderson student who recently won accolades for a standout performance at Carnegie Hall. But first, it's been described as a masterpiece and a singular journalistic performance. The book, Mother Emanuel, 2 Centuries of Race, Resistance, and Forgiveness, examines the historical context of the racist mass shooting that claimed 9 lives in Charleston in 2015. Here to talk about it is Jacksonville native and senior New York Times investigative reporter Kevin Sack. Good morning, Kevin.
And it's so great to be with you.
I'm so glad that you're able to be here and be here in person. So you were not living in Charleston at the time that this tragedy occurred, and you're typically not like a breaking news reporter. So how did you get on this story in the first place?
That's right. At the time that this happened, I was on our investigative team, the Times' investigative team, living in Atlanta. And I was sitting at home watching CNN as the first reports came over in real time, and literally looked up from my reading when they said that this had happened at an African Methodist Episcopal church. I had never heard of Mother Emanuel at that point, but and they had not released any detail yet about the shooter, his race or his intentions. But just the fact that it was an AME church sort of made my heart sink. I just suspected that this was going to wind up being the hate crime that it was. And I had written a lot about race over the years in the South, and particularly the intersection of race and faith, race and politics. And so I had a natural interest. I immediately started Googling the church because I had no real sense of the place, and began to see just the basic outlines of this remarkable history, that it was the oldest AME congregation in the South, that it had been formed in this audacious act of rebellion, a withdrawal by thousands of African-American Methodists from white-controlled churches in Charleston. It had reformed during Reconstruction, and the pastor during Reconstruction had gone on to become one of the 16 Republican African-American congressmen elected during Reconstruction. It had a storied civil rights history. And as I learned a little bit about the history, it started to occur to me that there might be a way to use this church as a vehicle, not only to tell the story of what had happened in 2015, but to look back over the 200 years of its life and use the church as a vehicle to tell this broader story of African-American life in Charleston, which I think we can all agree may have the most significant racial history of any city in America. 46% of all enslaved Africans who disembarked in North America did so in the port of Charleston. And of course, the Civil War began there. So the church really became a template to tell this larger story.
And this story does go so far beyond the crime. In many ways, it's about a lot of things other than that. The history of the AME Church, as you mentioned, the history of Charleston as the busiest slave port and kind of the enduring legacy of slavery and segregation. But one really striking element of the book is this focus on forgiveness. And you kind of begin with that because it manifested as a theme almost from the earliest days after the shooting. Can you just remind us what role the families played in planting that seed that kind of becomes a theme for the book?
This literally started the day after the shootings. The following night, there was a memorial service at a high school where one of the victims had taught and coached, and her son, Chris Singleton, the woman's name was Sharonda Singleton. She was one of the ministers at the church. Chris and his sister Cameron walk out, and a British TV reporter thrusts a microphone in their face, asks them what they're feeling, and Chris just instinctively says, we're feeling nothing but love right now. There's nothing but love from our family, and we already forgive him for what he had done. The next day, there's a bond hearing, the first court appearance for the killer who had been captured in North Carolina the morning after the shootings. And at that bond hearing, 5 family members, none of them knew that they were even going to be afforded an opportunity to talk in court, but they were. And when they did, each of them walked up to the microphone and one after the next offered some expression of forgiveness towards the killer. They hadn't seen Chris's interview or heard it, but it's almost like they were channeling his words. And so, yes, from the get-go, part of what drove my exploration was, wow, what is this all about? I think like everybody, I was simultaneously awestruck by what had happened in court that day and befuddled by it. And I wanted to know more. How had that emerged from the tradition of the Black church? And so part of what really drove this work for the better part of a decade was the notion that somewhere within the history of the congregation and the history of the denomination might lie the answer to that question. What did those expressions of forgiveness really mean within the context of centuries of Black suffering and within the context of Black Christianity?
And early in the book, you talk about this forgiveness. You say, you describe it as, quote, a time-worn survival mechanism, a tactic that had helped African Americans withstand enslavement, forced migration, captivity, indentured servitude, segregation, discrimination, denial of citizenship, and the constant threat of racial and sexual violence, with their souls still somehow intact. And you continue, this, after all, has been the story of African people and their descendants in the South Carolina Low Country for nearly 500 years. And really, the book sort of encapsulates all of that. And you do this deep dive and a really difficult read in a lot of ways into all of that. But you also talk about, the discussion of the role of forgiveness and the complexity of it. Not everybody that witnessed those statements of forgiveness endorsed them. Many people thought it was a form of accommodation. And it's interesting because the theme of accommodation also emerges in this book as kind of like a counterpoint to the notion of forgiveness.
That's right. And I've interviewed all of the folks who express forgiveness, and to a one, they will tell you that it was not premeditated or planned. They describe it in mystical terms, really, that it was God talking. They were merely the vessel. Chris Singleton tells me that, he still can't believe that the words came out of his mouth. But he knows that it was God because he still feels this way about forgiveness. Those folks were not talking for everybody in the community, everyone in the church, even everyone in their own families. There were families that were deeply divided over the decisions by some members to offer forgiveness. And as I talked to them, it became clear to me that the forgiveness that they offered was less for the killer, Dylan Roof, than it had been for themselves. That it really was this survival mechanism that had been adapted by African American Christians over the generations as a way to get through, a way to get by, a way to get out of bed every morning and put one foot in front of the other in the face of the oppression and discrimination and mistreatment that they have faced over the years. And the more that I heard, the more that I thought, I spoke to a lot of theologians about this, it started to feel to me that really what was going on was that this was a reclamation of agency by people who had been victimized, and it was a statement that the victimizer was not going to control the rest of their lives. One of the folks that spoke at the bond hearing, Anthony Thompson, himself a pastor, and the widower now of Myra Thompson, who had led the Bible study that night, told me that what forgiveness had done for him was it meant that he was not going to make a lifetime partner of this guy. And that made a lot of sense to me.
That was the phrase he used.
That was the phrase he used. And so to me, I think that forgiveness in the context of that it happened at Mother Emanuel, while yes, some of the community saw it as accommodationist, and I understand that, I really thought that it was its own form of resistance. For the ability to forgive was the one thing that could not be taken away from these people by their victimizer.
If you're just joining us, we're talking with reporter and author Kevin Sack about his new book, Mother Emanuel, 2 Centuries of Race, Resistance, and Forgiveness in One Charleston Church. You can join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at WJCT.org, or you can reach out on Facebook, Instagram, or X at FCC On Air. We've got a call from Wells on the South Side. Good morning, Wells. Go ahead.
Good morning, Ann, and good morning to your guest. This seems to be a book that needs to be in our schools. It needs to be part of the curriculum. The question here is, will this book be banned from our schools? Tuesday night, tomorrow night at 5:30, Prudential Drive, school board headquarters, there will be a rally outside before the meeting starts to protest the removal of DEI from our school district. I want to invite all your listeners and viewers to participate in that rally. Going back to the question of whether this book will be available to our children, race is connected directly with the economic structure that we live under. And one of the reasons why this information is kept from our children is to perpetuate this false ideology of white superiority. And I'll just leave it at that. And I want to thank the author for writing this book. Thank you. And thank you, Ann.
Thanks, Wells. Just briefly, what time is that rally outside the school board headquarters?
5:30.
All right, thank you. So there is a discussion, as he mentioned, Kevin, tomorrow night about removing DEI from all local school district policies as a goal. And obviously there's been a much larger debate in Florida about how we teach history, how we teach Black history, has been particularly controversial. Can you talk a little bit about whether those discussions played into your interest or decision to write this book?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, thanks for the comment and the question, Wells. I appreciate it. And from your lips to God's ears, I hope that it is available in schools all over this county and all over the state. I could not have predicted what the political environment was going to be at the time the book was published. The book has been 10 years in the making. But I certainly think that the moment that we are in reinforces what I hope is a major takeaway from the book, which is that this history really matters and needs to be told. And yes, I certainly think that we are now facing an environment both federally and in the state where this history is being diminished, denied, ignored, erased, and I think we do that at our own very real peril.
And so as a reporter, investigative reporter covering a topic like this, what is your sense of, the need to unearth some of the history surrounding the history of slavery and oppression in South Carolina? To kind of provide that contextual backstory.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I spent a career writing about the most recent components of that history, but I think it's so important to understand the backstory, and the church was a fabulous microcosm for that thesis. I mean, it mattered very much what happened on June 17th, 2015, but it particularly mattered because of everything that had happened in the 200 years before. And part of what really drove my curiosity was the notion that the church should not forever be known only for what happened that night, and that people should understand why it mattered so much that the killer had targeted this particular place. You know, it doesn't always matter. Sometimes a target can feel sort of random. And I don't know that the killer in this instance knew all that much about the history of the church, but he certainly understood that it was a historic black church, and he certainly had some visceral sense of the role that the black church played in the black freedom struggle. And so I think that component of the targeting was very deliberate. And I thought it mattered that people know about the 200 years that had brought the congregation to that very horrible moment.
And you get very, deep into the history of the AME Church, which its foundation was breaking away from kind of the Methodist Episcopal Church that it had been a part of, and so it is formed in this radical act that really was, an insult, a reaction to white supremacy, and you get into how churches at the time were kind of integrated on a level, but it wasn't in. It was a form of supervision, a form of keeping people who were enslaved or free blacks from worshiping freely and on their own.
That's right. So, the Methodist denomination, founded by the Wesley brothers, made its way across the Atlantic and took hold, particularly in the mid-Atlantic states and areas like Philadelphia, Maryland, Baltimore. And the AME, African Methodist Episcopal denomination, split off from it in Philadelphia around 1816. After a series of insults to the black worshiping community in churches in Philadelphia. The straw that broke the camel's back there was that black leaders of the congregation walked into a service at St. George's Methodist Church one Sunday and were told to go to a different seating area that had been designated for them, and they were literally lifted off their knees during prayer to do so. At which point, Richard Allen, who was the founder of the denomination, led this walkout from that church and formed his own denomination. Almost the exact same thing happened in Charleston a year or so later, in 1817. In Charleston, the Methodist churches were dominated in terms of membership by their African-American members, very few white members. And this was explicitly because the denomination had formed very much as an abolitionist faith at that point. That changed later on. But because of that, you had this governance problem of large congregations of enslaved African Americans worshiping in churches that were controlled by small numbers of whites. And eventually, there were political differences. The straw that broke the camel's back in this case was the construction of a garage for a horse-drawn hearse over a black burial ground. And at that point, Richard Allen's doppelganger in Charleston, a man named Morris Brown, who was a free person of color and a shoemaker, a man of some means, led this walkout of thousands of African Americans from white-controlled Methodist churches. And they very quickly purchased a piece of property in Charleston Neck and built their own building. That was immediately perceived as a threat by the white population, and a severe one. This was unthinkable. And there were mass arrests. Leaders of the church were jailed. Services were raided. And then eventually, 4 years later, after the discovery of a slave insurrection plot that was tied closely to the church, known as the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy, the church was literally dismantled, board by board. Dozens of men were arrested and tried. 35 were sent to the gallows. 17 of them, fully half of them, were members of the church or in some way associated with the church. Almost seemed to me like it was the church itself that was on trial.
And you talk about that, the fears of a uprising being very, predominant in white Charleston at the time. And you talk about this idea of a breakaway church almost akin to spitting in a white man's face. It was just that unthinkable at the time. But there was a lot of concern to keep people who were worshiping from that being a conduit to sort of independent thinking or the push to revolt. And this VC incident, which you say would have been the most consequential and lethal uprising had it been successful in the history of the United States.
Yes, and it was only discovered because there were enslaved people who were concerned about the blowback and went to their enslavers and reported on the plot that was in the making. The Charleston Peninsula just went crazy. Patrols, curfews, mass arrests, and then in the years following, after the conspiracy was discovered and put down, there were literally decades of oppressive legislation, both on the local level and the state level, that robbed particularly free people of color, but also the enslaved of any remaining autonomy that they had, including the right to worship on their own, essentially without supervision, the right to run schools, the right to hold certain jobs, do certain kinds of work. So the life for African Americans of all stripes in Charleston became much, much different after this than it had been before.
And this book, in addition to exploring the history of the AME Church, is also just a real reminder of the virulent racism that dominated in South Carolina, obviously in many slave states and many states that weren't slave states. But the population of South Carolina was unique because it was overwhelmingly African American because of the slave population and because of and in Charleston as well. But the fact that there was also a lot of free blacks living in South Carolina at the time, which was seen as such a threat to the order of things, that there was these laws passed that basically limited who could come, limited the number of free blacks that could come, and actually imperiled those who did come to South Carolina, who could essentially find themselves sold into slavery or taken hostage, essentially.
Yeah. I think the most telling piece of legislation that I came across was a law that was passed that, forbade free people of color from immigrating into South Carolina. And there was a very minor exception written into the law, which was that if you happened to arrive on South Carolina's shores because you were a seafarer on a ship that had wrecked and it basically floated onto the beach and into the state, that was okay as long as you made your way back out of the state in I think it was a 2-week or a 4-week period, something like that. So yes, they became super paranoid about this free black population. Started before the VC conspiracy, but certainly after that was uncovered, there was a feeling that these folks presented a real and urgent and dire threat. And there was an effort in any number of ways to essentially eliminate that entire population from the state.
And VC himself had been a seafarer, for a time, and wasn't it that kind of precipitated this move when ships came into the port at Charleston, that if someone was of color or of African descent, they were actually taken off the ships and jailed while their ship was in port?
That's right. There was something called the Negro Seaman Act, which wound up being adopted, I believe, by every southern state eventually, but started in South Carolina. And this law stated that, yes, if even a foreign vessel flying the flag of another country came into Charleston's port with a free African-American seafarer aboard, those people had to be temporarily jailed while in Charleston. And the notion was to prevent the spread of dangerous ideas, right? I mean, these people traveled the world, so they came armed with knowledge of the way the world worked and of abolitionist movements. Sometimes they might even have abolitionist newspapers or tracts on board. And so this was seen as extremely dangerous and threatening, and the white population of Charleston took just a remarkable number of extreme measures to control that population and to control the flow of information.
And the people who worshipped at the AME church were fairly routinely subjected to, as you said, raids. There was a place that was nicknamed the Sugar House, which was essentially a government-run torture chamber.
That's right.
And people were hauled from that church to this place and whipped or, in other ways, abused at the hands of the government.
Yeah, the site of it is just a few blocks from where I live in Charleston now. I walk by it all the time, and it's chilling. It's now marked by a historical marker. But yes, it was a prison where torture was essentially outsourced. If a slave holder didn't want to get his hands literally dirty by flogging a wayward slave, they would send them to the sugar house. And the phrase was, you best behave or I'll send you for a little sugar. And African Americans in Charleston very much understood what that meant. There was a dungeon in this place where the walls were just lined with knotted whips, and it just the reputation endures.
So, in studying this, you actually, are kind of a historian by training in addition to being a reporter. But you're going to a lot of original sources to try to find this history, to uncover it. And one of the things that you talk about in the book is kind of the bias of history, the way that some of the records that you're looking to are themselves, because of who they're written by or sort of the political, personal aims of whoever wrote them, that you're getting it through a filter that doesn't tell you the truth.
Yeah. Well, it's a real problem when you're dealing with African American history, certainly in the antebellum period, when literacy was so restricted. And so the result is that what we know largely comes through white hands and white eyes. That was the case, as perhaps more than with any other part of the book, with the Vesey conspiracy. There's a wonderful, extensive trial record, and also reports from government leaders, from the governor, letters from the mayor, things like that. But they're all from the view of white people, and those folks did not necessarily have the same experience of events that African Americans in Charleston had, and so the reporting that was done, the history that we have, is largely biased in that way, and only tells one side of the story. And it's just a hole that we have in history, and it's very difficult to fill. I found this across my reporting. Things start to improve a great deal, obviously, once you get past the Civil War. And interestingly, one of the most useful sources that I found was the Christian Recorder, which was the AME national newspaper, founded in 1852, I believe, and you can still find copies in archives and online. And as AME missionaries came down to Charleston in South Carolina to do their work and form new churches, they filed these incredibly rich dispatches back to this newspaper, not only about the life of the church, but the life of the community in the city. And I found those really, really valuable in trying to piece together what had happened, and also to finally have events described in black voices. You can really feel it during the Reconstruction period. These folks come down south. There's this incredible new hope and all this optimism for the future. It eventually gets dashed very quickly, obviously, but you really sense it in their letters back to the newspaper about how many, the hundreds and hundreds of people who are coming to the church, all of the events that they have, the new baptisms, the weddings. There's a real vibrancy that comes across.
Yeah, it is a very compelling piece of this book is the optimism, as you say, of that period of Reconstruction, which so often is kind of because it was pulled back and ultimately a broken promise is something that we don't necessarily spend a ton of time digging into, but the optimism of the voter registration, the people who were being elected, this astonishing period of going from abject slavery to empowerment, and it's really a remarkable piece of history to delve into. If you're just joining us, we're talking to Kevin Sack. He is the author of Mother Emanuel. It is a book that was released on the 10th anniversary of the tragic shooting at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. And you can join our conversation by calling 904-549-2937 or emailing firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. In terms of the bias of history, you have this marvelous example of two people who interviewed the same formerly enslaved woman within a short period of time, and they came from very different perspectives.
Susie Hamlin was her name. And it is remarkable. There were hundreds and hundreds of formerly enslaved people who were interviewed during the New Deal by people who were working for the WPA, and they put together they compiled these slave narratives. Well, one of them is Susie Hamlin's. The thing that's remarkable about her narratives are that she actually was visited twice by correspondents for the program, once by an African-American man and once by a white woman. And both wrote up their reports, and both are available. And she tells totally different stories to the two of them. With the white woman, it's all acquiescence. It's an accommodation. The woman asks her at some point, she's telling the woman about the work that she did, and that much of the money that she would earn for the work that she did
when she was
outside
hired
of home,
out.
when she was hired out, would go back to her master. And the woman says, well, shouldn't it have been that way? Because, he owned you. And she says, well, of course it should have been that way. Because, I was his, and he needed to make something for my labor. Later on, she's interviewed by an African-American man. And in those conversations, she is unblinking in describing the brutality of enslavement, the whippings, the burnings, the mistreatment. As I recall, there's one point that was particularly affecting, where she talks about how during slave weddings, the preacher would not say, "Let no man put asunder," because the day after the marriage, the family would be broken up and one member sold to another plantation.
Really an amazing, small tale in a story that is full of them. I want to ask you about the kind of the idea of forgiveness and original sin, because it is sort of something that is foundational to Christianity, and this idea that we're all born into sin and we kind of carry that. And mostly Christians of all stripes are accepting of that concept. And yet the idea of sort of America's original sin, as sometimes slavery is referred to, there is not perhaps that same appetite to accept responsibility, ownership, understanding of that as a foundational grievance. Have you thought much about kind of why that is, why there is that dichotomy between people of that faith?
Well, I certainly think that.
Well, let me ask you in a different way. I mean, in part because I think that there's this idea of original sin as in the context of slavery is something that people see as something that kind of divides the America, and often white and black America, in terms of how we perceive it.
Right.
It is not something that I think we conceive of in the fullest way, slavery and the impact and kind of the horrors of it. I think very often it's kind of described as a period that happened and not with the in-depth analysis that you kind of
Yeah.
take in this book of exploring the daily degradation and kind of the eternal scarring that's caused by a life in slavery.
That's really the point of the book. Is the church's story gave me the opportunity to string together that story over a 200-year period, and that was one of the real appeals to me. Was that I think that a lot of our history, certainly a lot of our African American history, is more narrowly focused on an event, on a leader, on a mode of thought, perhaps, or a movement. And this book allowed me to tell that story over a 200-year period. And yes, we know it, and yet it is nonetheless shocking and horrifying when you remind yourself of it, whether by writing a book like this or hopefully by reading a book like this, that this systematic racism, and I don't think there's any other way to describe it, has been with us from the get-go and continues all the way through the course of this book. It's what drove the creation of this church in 1817, 1818. It's what drove Dylan Roof to walk through an unlocked door in 2015 and kill 9 members of the church who were doing nothing but worshiping with their eyes closed.
We have a call from Susan in Fruit Cove. Good morning, Susan. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you so much for taking my call. I've been, aware in my gradual waking up to things. So one of the first books that helped me so much was The Invention of Wings, whose author escapes me, but
Sue Monk Kidd.
Who was it?
Sue Monk Kidd.
That's right, Sue Monk Kidd. And the amazing thing is how that story has just been affirmed over and over again with reality, with what actually happened. So thank you so much for writing the book. And recently, what amazed me, we had celebration where I live for Juneteenth. And the joy in the movies, they have movies of what happened that day. And the joy was overwhelming to me because I didn't know about that part of it. And what you've just said, too, about the fact that people made a difference. They made effort and worked so hard. And, we've never acknowledged that. So I just want to thank you so much, both of you, for exploring it from the heart. My faith has made it hard for me because I don't think so many people who worship don't get that original sin and original blessing, which actually came first. God said the creation was good and everyone in it was good. Mm-hmm. We acknowledge we failed. Original sin is true, but before that was the original blessing. And I just seek for people to explore that in their everyday life.
Susan, thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate the comment, Susan. One of the things that really struck me about the shootings at the very start was just what a commentary it was on the persistence of extreme racial violence, right? That in a post-civil rights age, we had litigated, we had legislated, we feel that things are progressing. We had elected a black president twice. People were talking about a post-racial America. This kind of incident obviously puts the lie to all of that, and brings us back to that confrontation that we have always had, and I fear must always have, with our original sin.
You mentioned the election of a black president, and of course, many people will associate Barack Obama with the AME church tragedy because he spoke at the funeral for the pastor of that church and gave a very, evocative speech. Tell us a little bit about, because you write about how he created that speech, and it's quite a story.
I was fortunate to be in the room that day. I covered the speech for the New York Times, and I encourage listeners to go back and take a look at it if you've got a spare 15 minutes sometime, because while we all remember it for his singing of Amazing Grace, it really is a remarkable piece of presidential oratory. And yes, the words were all his, and it is kind of a cool story. Obama at first did not want to go to Charleston to speak at this funeral. He was frustrated. He was deeply hurt. He took this one personally, and he was very upset at his inability to get any significant gun control legislation through a Republican Congress. And he kind of felt he was out of things to say about it. Advisors eventually prevailed upon him the importance of going, I think Valerie Jarrett in particular. And he goes and doesn't really know what he's going to talk about until the scene at the bond hearing where these expressions of forgiveness are made. And then he says, that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about grace and forgiveness and its meaning in the Black church. And his speechwriter struggles to give him a draft a couple of days before the speech, and he calls the speechwriter back to the White House at about 10 o'clock at night, a couple of nights before the speech is to be delivered, and hands him the draft back. The first couple of pages, he's scribbled through all kinds of words and struck out sentences. He's got notes in the margins, and then by the time you get to the last 2 pages, he's taken a pen and literally drawn diagonal lines all the way through the page. I can imagine it's got to be a speechwriter's worst moment. And he then proceeds to rewrite in hand, in ink, on a legal pad, the last couple of pages of the eulogy, structuring the entire thing around Amazing Grace, which then leads to his singing of the song. And I've interviewed the speechwriter who says that Obama was almost never self-congratulatory about a speech, but that he came back on to Air Force One after delivering that one and sort of peeked his head into the cabin and looked at the speechwriter and said, I think that one went okay. The speechwriter says, yeah, I think that one went pretty well.
That one pretty good. And, that theme of forgiveness, again, weaving its way through the story of this church. Part of the history of this church was in the civil rights movement, and you get into that a little bit. It was maybe a little late into that, but once in, very much led by a pastor who himself had been brutalized by the Klan and by law enforcement and really tortured, teaching young people how to turn the other cheek.
Yeah. He's my favorite character in the book, Reverend Benjamin J. Glover, known as B.J. Glover. And he was the longest-serving pastor at Emanuel from 1953 to 1965, so his term overlapped with the civil rights movement. And he was simultaneously the branch president of the Charleston NAACP. So yes, he used the church to lead demonstrations, marches, mass meetings were held, and the congregation didn't always go for it. There was a lot of concern. You'll remember that in 1963, 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham had been dynamited and 4 little girls had died in the explosion. There was a lot of fear within Emanuel that the same kind of thing could happen in Charleston.
Well, that is just one of many extraordinary elements of this book. It really is, a totally educational read. And I thank you so much for writing it and for being here to talk about it. He's the author of Mother Emanuel, 2 Centuries of Race, Resistance, and Forgiveness in One Charleston Church. Kevin, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks to you, Ann. Appreciate it.
All right. Up next, a Douglas Anderson piano virtuoso tells us about his recent critical triumph at Carnegie Hall.
Looking for a cool escape this summer? Catch the classic film noir DOA at WJCT Studios, Wednesday, July 2nd. Doors at 6:30, movie at 7. It's a special summer noir night, because who says we have to wait for Noirvember to get our mystery fix?
I want to report a murder. Who was murdered? I was.
Killer vibes, vintage style, and a story that still hits hard. Grab your tickets now at wjct.org/film. DOA. See it before time runs out.
A group called the Zizians has been linked to a string of deaths across the U.S., and it has roots in Silicon Valley AI research.
The inevitability or likelihood of a coming superintelligence and the need to ensure that this superintelligence is aligned with human values and morality.
I'm Deborah Becker. Who are the Zizians? That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11, here on WJCT News 89.9.
On the next Fresh Air, we talk with Jeffrey Seller, who played a key role as a producer of the Broadway musicals Rent, Hamilton, In the Heights, Avenue Q, and the revival.
President Trump says he's bringing religion back to the country. We continue our If You Can Keep It series by assessing the boundaries of the separation between church and state. And we sit down with former CIA analyst and current Democratic Senator Elissa Slotkin to talk Iran, immigration, and the future of the Democratic Party. That's all next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. A student at Douglas Anderson School of the Arts has been racking up accolades both here and at a recent performance at Carnegie Hall. Mark Magyar joins me now ahead of his performance next month at the International Vienna Piano Competition. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's wonderful to have you here. So you are now going into your second year at Douglas Anderson. But as I mentioned, you recently won this first prize in the Crescendo International Piano Competition at Carnegie Hall,
Yes.
both for solo and the duet categories. How did it feel?
It felt really good. Basically how it went. So my piano teacher at Douglas Anderson, Miss Watson, she suggested that we should join an international piano competition, which was the Crescendo Piano Competition. So we enrolled in it, and my mom recorded me and Janine Alexander, I was playing the duet with.
Mm-hmm.
So we played two pieces. My solo was the Sonata Pathétique third movement, and also the Beethoven's Fifth Symphony arrangement.
Wonderful. And so how is it intimidating to be at an audience, to be performing in Carnegie Hall?
Yeah, I get a bit nervous before I perform, but I try to calm myself down. It's getting better because I'm beginning to get used to playing in front of an audience.
So you started playing piano when you were about 3 or 4 years old, just on your own. Is that right?
Yes, so I started when I was 3 years old. So I come from a non-musician family. So I had a toy piano, which many people have. And my mom discovered that we were playing actual melodies by Beethoven and Mozart.
Wow, you were actually playing classical, recognizable music.
Yes. And then when I was 4 years old, I got a real piano. So my parents bought me a real piano. It was a Mendelssohn upright piano that I was able to play on. So my parents let me play by ear, and when we were ready, she took me to have lessons with Miss Lynn Radcliffe, who is my mentor to this day, and she noticed how special we were. So she didn't do the teaching methods how everyone else would. She would let us compose music. So you could actually just come up with your own compositions. I should say you continue to come up with compositions, and I would like to hear a little bit of one of them that is, I believe it's called Easter? Yes.
Okay, it's one of your original pieces. Let's take a little listen. wonderful. We should say for people who are watching online, we're also able to watch you play there as well. And that's a beautiful melody that you're playing. Where does your inspiration come from?
So my inspiration, like I usually like think up of a melody, and then like however I feel, like I like to express my feelings into music. So
So it's just kind of an expression of what you're feeling emotionally and what you're thinking about.
yes.
So you have a twin, I understand, also a pianist,
Yes.
and I'm guessing there must be sort of a little bit of healthy competition between the two of you.
Yes.
How does that? Do you play competitively? Does he also go to some of these events?
Um, so my brother Daniel, he is not a competitor like me. He's not really like the type of person to like go on these competitions. I'm more of like the competitor.
I gotcha. And so I know that, you've talked about the importance of classical music education being part of classroom curriculum. And I'm wondering if you can kind of explain why you think that's important.
So like there's a whole lot of kids who are not going to concert halls who've never been exposed to classical music. Like they've mostly been listening to pop artists, like all different genres, like rap, hip hop, etc. So like not many of these kids are exposed to classical music.
And what do you think it brings to somebody when they listen to classical music that perhaps listening to pop music doesn't provide?
So like classical music, like it's like it brings more emotions.
Mm-hmm. And like good emotions, does it make you feel a certain way?
Like classical music brings all sorts of emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Like it can be happy, it can be sad, it can be like all sorts of emotions.
Well, I am delighted that you're going to be doing this competition. This is in the International Vienna Piano Competition. We wish you the best of luck. Mark Magyar, thank you so much for being here.
Of course, it's my pleasure to be here.
All right, and thank you for listening. That's our program. If you have comments or suggestions, you can send either to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. The executive producer of First Coast Connect is David Luckin. Our show is
Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. Terrell Hogan Law.
I'm Wayne Hogan. Highway, hospital, home, work. Where injuries happen can make a difference in the law and the outcome.
More at terrellhoganlaw.com.